From claw marks the size of your arm to fossilized gut contents and stomach stones that give us snapshots of a dinosaur's last meal, dinosaurs left us more than just bones. In 2024 alone, paleontologists uncovered over 50 new species, including feathered surprises that rewrite what we thought we knew. But here's the twist. Our ancestors once believed some of these very fossils belonged to dragons or even fallen giants. The path from ancient legends to modern fossil labs was anything but straightforward, and those early misunderstandings tell us as much about human history as they do about the dinosaurs themselves. From dragons to dinosaurs. For millennia, people uncovered strange, oversized remains without any concept of what they truly were. There was no understanding of deep time, no framework for extinction, and no reason to think the Earth had once been home to animals utterly unlike those alive today. When enormous bones, dagger-sized teeth, or puzzling imprints emerged from the ground, the only tools available to explain them were the beliefs, stories, and imagery already embedded in each culture. In many cases, those interpretations were wildly inventive, and, at times, surprisingly close to aspects of the truth. In China, fossilized bones, known as dragon bones, were ground into traditional remedies for centuries, a practice documented as far back as the 4th century BC by the historian Chang Chu in the Wuhan region. Villagers, scholars, and physicians alike saw them as the remains of legendary serpentine creatures and valued them as much for their supposed healing powers as for their mythical significance. This use meant many significant finds were chipped apart and sold in powdered form. Their scientific value lost long before paleontology existed as a discipline. The dragon label endured because the creatures already had a rich place in local art and mythology. Long bodies, fierce faces, and scaled textures that, in some cases, would not look too out of place beside certain dinosaur reconstructions today. To the ancient Greeks, giant skeletal fragments, whether an immense femur or a piece of skull, were often read as proof of the mighty beings from legend. In a world that celebrated tales of titanic warriors battling gods and monsters, such finds became tangible evidence supporting those myths. Over time, bones from large prehistoric mammals mixed into the same imagined category. Without the ability to distinguish species or geological ages, these relics took on whatever identity best matched the cultural narratives at hand. Centuries later, in the 17th and 18th centuries, even early scientists sometimes reinforced these ideas, interpreting fossil bones as belonging to ancient human giants. In parts of North America, many native peoples also encountered fossils and trackways preserved in stone. Some footprints, wider than a human torso, lay exposed for anyone to see. In certain plains traditions, such colossal tracks became linked to the paths of Thunderbirds, enormous, powerful birds whose wing beats were said to make the sky rumble. Although these stories understandably framed the evidence in spiritual terms, the association with large, bird-like creatures now seems uncannily fitting given the evolutionary ties between birds and theropod dinosaurs. What emerges from these varied cases is a clear pattern. Unfamiliar finds were interpreted through the lens of familiar beliefs. In lands where dragons dominated art and folklore, the remains became dragon bones. In cultures that told of giants, they were giant remains. In those where colossal birds loomed in oral tradition, immense fossilized footprints became their tracks. This was not random guesswork. It was a logical, human way to fold new and puzzling information into an existing worldview. Some of these visions of the past, viewed today, stray closer to accuracy than one might expect. Eastern depictions of dragons, with elongated skulls, toothy jaws, long tails, and scaled bodies, bear a distant resemblance to certain theropods and long-necked sauropods. Thunderbird legends connected to tridactyl prints align well with the footprint patterns left by some three-toed theropod dinosaurs. No ancient artist had a literal image of a dinosaur in mind, but broad traits like reptilian forms and massive scale were, on occasion, eerily on target. Of course, no one in these early societies looked at a fossilized vertebra and thought in terms of Mesozoic timelines or extinct reptilian clades. They had no charts of geological ages, no comparative anatomy studies, and no technology for dating specimens. For them, it made sense to see such relics as belonging to magical or supernatural beings. The idea that they might be from a species that lived millions of years before humans would have been unimaginable. The cultural weight given to these interpretations was powerful. In some communities, specific fossil-rich landscapes became woven into oral histories. A hill where large bones turned up could be known as the place where a serpent was slain, or the site of a legendary battle. Even if the fossils eroded or were taken away over time, The stories rooted in those locations could outlast the physical evidence. By the time trained scientists arrived centuries later, the legend often remained while the fossils were long gone. These beliefs tended to reinforce themselves. If an elder or healer declared a type of fossil to have special properties, each new discovery only confirmed that narrative. Artistic depictions influenced how future finds were interpreted. Seeing bones with certain shapes could prompt people to fit them into pre-existing visual models for myth. Evidence and story fed into each other in a loop that remained stable for generations. Seen in context, dragons, giants, and thunderbirds were more than just products of the imagination. They were attempts, based on direct encounters with real physical objects, to understand a past no one could truly remember. Enormous bones and prints inspired awe, speculation, and creative explanation. While the conclusions were shaped by culture rather than science, they still carried a faint echo of creatures that had walked the planet long before humans. Over centuries, these enduring myths survived alongside the periodic unearthing of new, equally mysterious remains. For a long time, the physical evidence and the imagined creatures it inspired remained connected only by story. But eventually, repeated discoveries began to pile up, and the gap between myth and reality started to narrow. It was in that shift, when those strange bones began to be seen as pieces of a real, vanished world rather than props in a legend, that the groundwork for a new kind of understanding took shape. The first dinosaur ID cards. By the late 1700s, unusual bones were appearing with greater frequency in Europe, pulled from quarries, coastal cliffs, and deep excavations. The difference now was that some naturalists were beginning to consider they might not be the remnants of dragons, giants, or other legends at all. Instead, these fossils could be the remains of animals that had once lived but no longer existed anywhere on Earth. At that time, the idea of extinction and deep time wasn't widely accepted, so giant bones were often shoehorned into existing biblical or mythic frameworks. Most educated Europeans still worked within a framework where every species created at the beginning continued to exist somewhere, perhaps in unexplored regions. Admitting a creature had vanished forever meant accepting that Earth's catalog of life could change, and that was a disruptive concept for an age trying to reconcile geological finds with a history measured in just a few thousand years. Matching these strange remains to living creatures was a challenge. The jaws of some herbivores carried teeth suited for grinding plants the size of small trees. Limb bones suggested animals taller than any known mammal. Without modern comparative anatomy, even experienced observers misidentified them. One colossal femur might be called the leg of a giant elephant by one scientist, and of a giant lizard by another. No one could agree on the age of these remains. Some thought they were casualties of a relatively recent global flood, while others dismissed them as unusual individuals from otherwise familiar species. By the early 1800s, a more coherent picture began emerging in Britain. A key breakthrough came in 1824, when geologist and clergyman William Buckland published the first scientific description of what would later be recognized as a dinosaur, naming it Megalosaurus, or Great Lizard. Based on fossils unearthed in Oxfordshire, Buckland described a massive quadrupedal reptilian predator, something like an oversized monitor lizard. Modern science reveals Megalosaurus walked on two legs with its tail held straight out, but in Buckland's time, nothing comparable had ever been seen. His work became a benchmark for how such fossils might be studied and described. Just over a decade later, further finds included the armored Hylaeosaurus and the plant-eating iguanodon, with teeth resembling those of modern iguanas but on a far larger scale. These and other specimens came under the study of Richard Owen, an ambitious anatomist with a talent for synthesis. Owen identified shared features that distinguished these reptiles from others: unique arrangements in the hips and limbs, as well as their impressive size. In 1842, he proposed gathering them under a new term: Dinosauria, or terrible lizards. The terrible referred not to malice but to their awe-inspiring nature. This naming made it possible to talk about them as a related group, linking scattered fossils into a single category. Owen's influence on early dinosaur science was significant, but the field was already peopled with distinctive characters. Mary Anning, collecting fossils along the cliffs of Lyme Regis, had uncovered spectacular marine reptiles and contributed findings that helped lay the foundations of paleontology itself. Her work, although focused on creatures like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, showed how careful observation in the field could transform scientific understanding of prehistoric life. The period also saw bitter rivalries and disputes over credit, as field collectors, illustrators, and scientists vied for recognition in a rapidly emerging discipline. Many reconstructions of these early dinosaur specimens were, from today's perspective, incorrect. Iguanodon was shown as a bulky reptile that walked on all fours, with what was actually a thumb spike placed as a horn on its snout. Artists modeled them on the reptiles they knew: crocodiles for stance, monitor lizards for limbs, and imagined them as slow, tail-dragging, cold-blooded behemoths. In Crystal Palace Park in London, enormous sculptures erected in the 1850s depicted these interpretations. They were a marvel of public education at the time, but the animals they portrayed bore only a superficial resemblance to the agile, dynamic dinosaurs modern paleontology describes. Even so, the shift from thinking these were oversized lizards of recent times to understanding them as members of a lost world marked a turning point. Acceptance of extinction became more widely entrenched, and with it came a profound change in perspective on the planet's age. The sheer variety and size of these fossil reptiles suggested lifespans for Earth far longer than previously imagined, laying the groundwork for concepts like evolution and deep geological time to gain traction. Public fascination grew alongside these developments. Fossil mounts in museums became major attractions, offering visitors the chance to stand next to towering skeletons and imagine the animals in life. The strangeness of their form was undeniable. The massive limbs, strange skull shapes, and sheer scale reshaped how people viewed their landscapes. Quarries, coastal cliffs, and mines took on new significance. They were no longer just sources of building material but possible windows into lost epochs. Newspapers reported new discoveries with enthusiasm, highlighting the debates among scientists and feeding public appetite for the subject. Reconstructing these animals was often an exercise in educated guesswork. Missing bones were filled in using the skeletons of living species as templates. Incomplete hips or shoulder assemblies could lead to radically wrong postures, sometimes crouched and sprawling when they should have been upright and balanced. These errors in turn influenced how the public and even scientists imagined dinosaur behavior, reinforcing the view of them as ponderous and plodding. The emerging scientific view didn't strip dinosaurs of their mystery, it reframed it. Where earlier ages had seen magical dragons, the Victorian era saw demonstrable evidence of nature's capacity to create giants and then eliminate them. Dinosaurs fit neatly into a growing fascination with the exotic and the monstrous, now backed by careful observation and classification instead of folklore. They remained impressive partly because they were not like any animal alive. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the discipline of paleontology was taking on a formal structure. Museum laboratories developed consistent procedures for preparing, cataloging, and preserving specimens. The word dinosaur had entered everyday language, and artists, writers, and the public embraced these animals as symbols of a deep and dynamic past. The recognition that such creatures were real, and no longer here, moved them out of the realm of legend and firmly into the domain of history and science. That shift invited later generations to both refine the science and reimagine these ancient giants, replacing early errors with reconstructions closer to the truth. Yet even as methods improved, one fundamental question persisted. What exactly was being preserved in those ancient layers of rock, and why had some creatures endured in exquisite detail while others vanished almost without a trace? That question brings us to the process that determines whether the remains of any creature will survive long enough to be found at all. The dirt on fossilization. A fossil may look like a piece of ancient bone waiting patiently in the ground for millions of years, but that's not what it is. By the time it reaches us, the original biological material has vanished. What remains is a stone cast, mineral by mineral. The living tissue has been replaced while the shape stays true to the original. The result is bone-shaped, but not bone. For this transformation to happen, three things must fall into place. First comes rapid burial. Flood-borne silt, volcanic ash, or a landslide must cover the body before scavengers or weather can destroy it. Second is mineral replacement. Water rich in dissolved minerals seeps through the remains, gradually swapping bone for stone while preserving microscopic detail. Third, in rare situations, those minerals preserve not just the form of the hard parts, but impressions or even molecular traces of skin, feathers, or other soft structures. The original organic tissue is almost always replaced, but in exceptional cases, the stone record is so fine it can capture details like the texture of a scale or the filament of a feather. Most animals never make it past the first hurdle. Exposure to scavengers, sediments with the wrong chemistry, or tectonic forces that crush buried layers can erase remains entirely. Even in promising settings, the odds are stacked against preservation. This is why the fossil record offers only fragments of life's history. Most species leave no trace at all. When fossils do endure, the amount of detail varies. Often only the most durable parts survive in recognizable form: teeth, thick limb bones, armored plates, while everything else collapses and disappears. In special environments, fine-grained layers build up gently around the body, locking in delicate surfaces without distortion. A lake bed settling in still water, a river delta burying remains under steady inflows of silt. These settings increase the chance that details will hold. Volcanic ash can act like a geological time capsule. Its particles settle quickly, sealing remains away from oxygen and decay while mineral-laden water works its way in. Ash beds also help scientists fix an age for the fossils they contain, since the minerals in them can be dated with precision. Long-term climate at the site matters too. Arid landscapes reduce decay and erosion, while humid areas speed both up. Some of the richest fossil beds formed where rivers, lakes, or coastlines steadily laid down sediment over thousands or millions of years, entombing whatever lived there in strata that built up and compacted over time. But preservation isn't just about where and how an organism was buried. It's also about geological luck. Rock layers have to be brought back toward the surface without being shattered or warped, and erosion must expose fossils slowly enough to reveal rather than destroy them. In a few places, those factors line up so perfectly that animal and plant remains are preserved with extraordinary clarity. Lagerstätten, sites of exceptional preservation, are the rarest of these. In northeastern China's Liaoning province, for example, lake beds from about 120 million years ago hold fossils where even feather barbs and occasional pigment traces remain visible. Volcanic ash settling over water, low oxygen at the lake bottoms, and the finest possible sediments combine to capture anatomical details invisible in most other deposits. Finds from here have reshaped how scientists see entire branches of the dinosaur family tree, especially their links to living birds. Capturing that level of detail requires a precise sequence: sudden burial, the right chemistry for mineralization, stability over immense spans of time, and a fortunate return to light without catastrophic damage. Break any step, and the evidence is gone. Those conditions also bias the fossil record towards certain environments and kinds of organisms. Marine life with hard shells, for example, appears more often than small, soft-bodied animals that lived on land. This means paleontologists often work from an incomplete set of clues, inferring whole creatures from the durable fragments that remain. The most remarkable fossils, those that capture the outline of a wing membrane or the weave of feather filaments, are not the norm but the rarest entries in a record already stripped down by time and chance. Understanding that fossils are geological copies rather than biological leftovers changes how we read them. They are not snapshots of life frozen in place. They are stone translations, sometimes rough, sometimes so precise they reveal textures and structures finer than a human hair. These are the records that make it possible to go beyond a skeleton and picture an animal as it was in life. Not just in form, but sometimes in surface detail and coloration. Such finds don't just tell scientists what a creature looked like. They influence where to search next, what preservation conditions to look for, and how to interpret other, less complete remains. They link anatomy to environment and behavior, allowing reconstructions that would otherwise be guesswork. But to place those reconstructions into the wider history of life, researchers still have to answer a central, more practical question. Once you have the fossil, how can you tell how old it is? How we date a dinosaur without asking its birthday. Dating a dinosaur fossil isn't as simple as looking for an age stamped inside the bone. By the time bone turns to stone, every trace of the original organic material is gone. That rules out direct clockwork tests like carbon-14 dating, which only works for remains up to about 50,000 years old. Far too short for Mesozoic timescales. Instead, paleontologists read the age from the surrounding rock, treating those layers as a built-in timestamp. The most dependable results come from radiometric dating, measuring how certain unstable elements naturally decay into stable forms over time. These isotopes act like clocks, each ticking at a fixed rate. For rocks of dinosaur age, scientists choose isotopes with very slow decay, able to measure spans of many millions of years. One workhorse is potassium, argon dating. When volcanic rock solidifies, it locks in potassium-40, which decays into argon-40. Because argon is a gas, any trapped in the crystals must have formed after the rock cooled. Measure the ratio, and you know when that mineral crystal was born. Uranium, lead dating works on a similar principle, but this clock runs inside hard, tiny zircon crystals often found in volcanic ash. Uranium isotopes decay into lead isotopes at known rates, and zircon's dense lattice traps both, resisting contamination. Comparing uranium to lead reveals the crystal's formation age, in some cases with precision down to tens of thousands of years despite a total age in the hundreds of millions. Ka-Ar, or its more refined variant, Ar-Ar, is useful for dating many volcanic minerals, while U-Pb on zircon can deliver extremely precise ages for ash beds. Both methods let scientists bracket fossils within sedimentary rocks. The complication is that most dinosaurs aren't entombed in volcanic rock at all. They're found in sedimentary layers built from sand, mud, and silt deposited long after the source rock formed. Those particles may have originated in much older rocks, so their mineral clocks reset long before the dinosaur's lifetime. Directly dating the fossil bed itself usually won't work. The workaround is to find volcanic ash layers, or bentonite beds formed from weathered ash, immediately above and below the fossil horizon. These layers can be dated radiometrically, creating a narrow time window in which the dinosaur must have lived. In many Cretaceous deposits in North America, such bentonite bands serve as geological bookends, pinned in time with uranium, lead or potassium, argon methods. Picture a skeleton lying between two pages in a book. If the page below was laid down 150.8 million years ago and the page above 150.3 million years ago, the animal's death falls neatly between those dates. On a geological timeline, that half-million-year span is impressively tight. Without it, the fossil might float in uncertainty spanning several million years, blurring its position in evolutionary history. Sometimes there's no helpful ash nearby. In those cases, paleontologists turn to tools like magnetostratigraphy, which uses the way certain minerals lock in the orientation of Earth's magnetic field when they form. Because the planet's magnetic poles have flipped many times, those reversals form a distinctive, datable pattern. Matching the local sequence of normal and reversed patches to the global record can narrow the age range of the rocks. Fossil correlation offers another clue. Certain species, especially small marine organisms with short evolutionary lifespans, appear globally and can serve as time markers. If one of these index fossils is found in the same layer as a dinosaur, and that species' time range is well known from other sites, the dinosaur's age can be estimated accordingly. This won't pinpoint a date on its own, but combined with radiometric or magnetic data, it strengthens the argument. Fieldwork often determines what's feasible. Layers may be faulted, tilted, eroded, or buried too deep to sample. Datable materials may appear only kilometers from the fossil. In some cases, the bones themselves could have been moved before final burial, carried by rivers or landslides into a slightly younger or older layer, a factor that demands careful mapping and sampling to avoid mistakes. A recent example shows how it all comes together. In southern Wyoming's part of the Morrison Formation, a swath of late Jurassic rock covering much of the American West, researchers uncovered an unusually well-preserved sauropod. The find was flanked above and below by thin volcanic ash bands. Geologists sampled zircon from each and used uranium, lead analysis to date them. The result was an age bracket only about 40,000 years wide. The sauropod lived roughly 150.13 million years ago, give or take 0.02 million. That's precise enough to compare population dynamics between sites and to ask whether similar species were roaming the same floodplains at the same time or separated by thousands of years of change. Precision matters. Dinosaur evolution works on slow timescales, but environmental and climatic shifts along the way could be abrupt. Knowing whether a particular species appeared before or after a drying event, or overlapped with a key predator, can change reconstructions of migration routes, extinction pulses, and adaptive strategies. Tight age control turns loose puzzles into testable hypotheses. Even then, geologists rarely take a single number at face value. Radiometric ages are cross-checked with stratigraphy, magnetostratigraphy, and relevant index fossils to guard against local complications that might skew a result. If multiple methods converge, confidence climbs. If they diverge, it's a signal to re-examine the samples, the context, or the assumptions. Collaboration between paleontologists and geochronologists keeps the process rigorous. From the outside, pinning an age on a fossil might seem like a straight shot from sample to number, but in the field it's a chain of interdependent steps. The geology of a site dictates the range of techniques available, and the quality of surrounding rock determines whether a dinosaur skeleton becomes a vague data point somewhere in a million-year block, or a precisely slotted entry in Earth's biological timeline. Results from well-bracketed sites can then be folded into larger patterns, tracking shifts in ecosystems, testing evolutionary sequences, or linking land-based changes to shifts in the oceans or atmosphere happening at the same time. This framework has become the backbone of modern dinosaur research. Without it, new fossil finds could only be admired as static curiosities. With it, they become fixed points that can be compared, sequenced, and interpreted side by side with discoveries from other continents. That kind of precise temporal map has been critical in recent years, as the pace of new species announcements continues to rise. When scientists started keeping score, tracking new dinosaur species wasn't always the well-calibrated process it is now. But once researchers began recording each confirmed addition in a standardized way, it became possible to see patterns. Some years slower, others seeing sharp jumps in the count. In 2024, that tally reached a level few anticipated. More than 50 completely new species formally described and named from finds around the world. These weren't half-formed identifications or speculative names.